coming towards the end of this, to this end, please. Hello? Okay, well, I will presume that whoever is interested in listening to this panel has already taken their seat, so I will make a start. Normally, the session after lunch is one of the more difficult ones. However, I think today we are rather privileged in the fact that we have three excellent speakers, and we have almost an hour and a half, which means that we're not going to be rushing through their presentations. And I will suggest that each one of them takes a quarter of an hour, so that they have plenty of time to make their points, and then of course we can have an open discussion. I'm not really the type of moderator who tries to set out a larger framework for the presentation. Especially in the context of the issues that we're discussing in this panel, because clearly there are so many angles which we can take on this. We can start looking at the big picture. We can start looking at how politically things are evolving in the region. We can have a discussion about policy instruments, soft power. I mean, there are all these many possible approaches. So I'm not going to be selecting any one of those, sort of hoping that we can sort of start guiding ourselves towards these issues in the context of the discussions, and sort of leave that choice to our panelists. So without really speaking any further, I would give the floor to Mrs. Apostolova and ask her to make her presentation, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's a great pleasure to be here in this distinguished public today. As you have seen, maybe already from the documentation, I had the privilege to be deputy head of our European Union delegation in Cairo for 3 years. I went there just before the revolution started. I lived through the revolution, and I actually left when El-Sisi retook the power. So at present, I am the head of the European Union delegation in Libya, another very challenging country. So I would like to kick off that discussion from the point of view how the European Union engages in this region, because it's a very important region. Why? Because these are the nearest neighbors to Europe. And this is extremely important, not only because of our good partnership, which we want to develop, like internal market and development in all sectors of life, but most because of the problems which also are raised with this close geographical position. Very recently, you saw the terrible accidents and the terrible tragedy, actually, Lampedusa 1 and 2. You see the migration flows which are entering into Europe. So it is not only the positive side, but there is also a very big negative side. So saying all that, I would like to make a comparison, starting by a comparison, how the European Union engaged in our countries. In the Western Balkans, in the Central European countries, when the enlargement process was going. It was very different, and the instruments which the European Union used then, unfortunately, are not applicable for the MENA region. Why? Because our countries, including the Western Balkan countries, with which now the negotiations are ongoing, we all and they had the clear perspective to become one day a European member state. So, of course, the negotiations in such a framework are very different when you have partners who do not want to become members. We are never going to see Egypt a member of the European Union. There is a statute avancé with Morocco, but this is very different. And Libya even doesn't want now to start any legislative relations with the European Union. So what I want to say is that our relations with this region is based on the so-called partnership agreements. These partnership agreements are very different from what we expected in the enlargement process, and the instruments which we use now are very different as well. We have the European Neighbourhood Policy instruments, and our distinguished speaker, Jerzy, is going to tell you about the Endowment of Democracy, which is one of that instruments. We have as well instruments like the Instrument for Stability, because most of these countries, unfortunately, are in crisis, and we have to deal with security issues. We have funds which are thematic and which are for civil society, for human rights, but they're very much more limited than those which were in the enlargement policy. So in this environment, I would like to share some experience how we engaged in this region. We have always had cooperation. Nevertheless, the regimes were, we call them now, totalitarian, and that's true. They are totalitarian, Mubarak, Gaddafi. Nevertheless, the European Union chose never to be isolated from this region. Why? First, because of the close geographical position of the region, and second, because the people who are living, the citizens in these countries, we wanted to target them. We did not want to help Gaddafi, we did not want to help Mubarak, but we wanted to support the civil society which was starting to grow even under Mubarak time. So our instruments were limited, but nevertheless they were working. After the Arab Spring, the European neighborhood policy had drastically to change. Why? Because of the Arab Spring. Because, as you know, most probably, the European procedures are extremely heavy and extremely lengthy. That's why we try to make a more flexible way of engaging with this region. And I think, at least in Egypt, we were quite successful. About Libya, with my 3 months experience, I must say that it's extremely difficult. And why? Because Libya is a very, very different example and case. The problem in Libya is security. So it is extremely hard to engage in improving the security of a country when normally this is under the auspices, under the domestic legislation, and this is the internal affairs of the state. So coming there and proposing different projects, you are always in Libya seen, and even this is the case, unfortunately, still as the spy. You are coming there, you have to go into their secrets, they have to propose you and to give you statistics, they have to give you idea how the military work, how the Ministry of Defense is structured, how the Ministry of Interior goes on. So this is a very, very hard process. I wouldn't say that we are going to give up, and we are not going to give up. Recently, the European Union deployed in Libya the EU Border Assistance Mission. This is a common foreign and security policy mission, which will maybe in 4 or 5 months comprise of 120 people. What we are doing there, we are trying the staff to help them protect better their border, because Libya has more than 4,800 kilometers of non-guarded border, which is a great issue. It is a great issue because Libya as well is the country which has such a weaponry and arms arsenal which is 150 times more than in Iraq. You can imagine what we are speaking about. And most of these stockpiles of weaponry are now without control. And bearing in mind that, and the fact that there are very strong non-state actors, which are the Tuars, the ex-revolutionaries, who unfortunately were not included into the social and political life of the country 2 years after the revolution. They got the weapons, and now they are the one dictating more or less the policy. You saw maybe in the news, and you followed 2 weeks ago, the prime minister was kidnapped. I haven't heard another state where the prime minister was kidnapped. So this is one of the symbols what means the security in this country. So I may stop here because I don't want to take all the time, but I'm sure that the co-speakers are going to build upon that basic discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's directly move to Mr. Sharqieh, and of course we have 1/4 of an hour. Feel free to make use of that time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this great introduction. I like that the subject of this panel on what should Europe do for the Middle East. And when I started thinking about this, actually, I realized that I probably should talk about, in the beginning at least, what Europe shouldn't do for the Middle East. Probably is a good start, to it's kind of foundation. I have 3 things that Europe shouldn't do, and then I'll talk about a few things that probably should or can do if Europe wants to do that. And with that, let me begin with the shouldn't do. The very first thing is that Europe shouldn't see the region only through security lenses. The region is not only about illegal immigration and only, when we feel that there is waves of illegal immigrations and there is a security threat is coming from Libya or from other countries, that's what will get the attention of Europe. When Libya began the revolution, a huge security threat, waves of illegal immigration, and then there is very serious European attention. And by the time, finished, Gaddafi is gone, then you're on your own. And just one example, and I'm glad that we're both in the same panel, is to talk about this issue, where Libya has been asking for a security assistance to build its security infrastructure, and after the removal of Gaddafi, and submitted an application from May of this year, and only after the kidnapping of the Prime Minister that the attention was, was gotten of Europe, and then the response to it was approving of 10 security experts is to help Libya with the security aspect. So that is the kind of approach, is that attention and then reaction to it, rather than having a more proactive approach and a real understanding of the partnership that we talked about, and that should govern this relationship. And then again, after it will need a kidnapping of a prime minister to take attention. There are issues other than security in this region. There are dictatorships. There are development issues that causing all these problems that are happening. And yes, the Middle East and Europe, they're here to stay. No one is going anywhere. So it's a neighborhood relationship between the two, and that's why I think that this view of security-based approach probably should not be the case. The other thing, the second thing that what Europe shouldn't do is that should not ally or have a foreign policy that's subordinate to U.S. foreign policy in the region. Europe will need to have some sort of independence of foreign policy in the region, because U.S. foreign policy is driven by mostly, among many factors, domestic factors, lobbying groups. So it's not the real issues that Europe, a neighborhood or a neighbor relationship that having with the region. So it's completely independently from what Europe and the Middle East should be having. So this independence, I think of, or subordinate relationship or foreign policy is something probably need to be revised. Though, to give Europe some credit, there has been some changes on the Palestinian issue, to a very small level, particularly on the issue of the settlements. Boycott of the settlements products on this issue, and to a certain extent also on the voting in the UN. But that's way, way, way below the expectations and what an independent European foreign policy in the Middle East region should look like, independently from the US foreign policy. The third thing, which is not to treat the region only on a very narrow realpolitik approach, is that only oil and security would again attract the attention of Europe and would pay attention to it. Currently, the most obvious example, of course, is Syria, where with Syria now the West, or this kind of a relationship or a foreign policy of US-Europe relationship, the people and the Syrian people viewed this as, sold them out, for the Assad regime and for a deal on the chemical weapons. Then that is the whole issue, the relationship is changing, and the whole issue with dealing with the Assad regime is changing. To the extent that the Assad regime, at some point, Assad himself was talking about probably he should be granted or given the Nobel Prize laureate. So this is at some point of this improvement of relationship on the issue of chemical weapons, while allowing the suffering and the slaughtering of the Syrian people is continuing. I'm not saying or advocating that you should start bombing Syria, but at some point, part of a deal is probably, as a part of this chemical weapon deal, is to at least have some sort of a safe zone, some sort of a ceasefire. Is just to stop this bloodshed that's happening in Syria. That would have probably earned the credibility and the trust of the people, not just to make a deal on the chemical weapons and leave the rest of the Syrian bloodshed continuing without any serious or real changes about it. The same thing on the Palestinian issue. There is ridiculous negotiation that's taking place. Everyone knows that it's futile negotiations. There is nothing is going to come out of this negotiation, and it's done for certain specific reasons. And what is the failure of this negotiation is going to cause is going to cause more frustration and a possible another revolution or another thing in the world. And then that will probably Europe pay attention at that point. So